It is that time of the year again when you are ready to file your income tax return and get your tax refund back. But if you're anything like a lot of Americans, there's a chance that you might be on the hook for additional taxes owed this year. And so I wanted to make a really simple and easy to understand video of some explanations of why you might owe additional income tax and how to properly plan for that. So, to jump in, I'm going to go through the big ideas, which is why this matters. Spoiler alert, everybody pays some form of taxes, whether it's income tax, property tax, sales tax. You're definitely going to be impacted. Whether you make no money or a lot of money, you're still paying tax. Two, I'm going to give a very high level overview of how taxes actually work in the United States. I'm going to explain what a refund is and how that's different than a tax return. I'm going to walk you through 3 hidden tax traps that I've seen already this year that are putting people in a position to where they owe more taxes. I'm going to wrap up with the big tax tip that I always recommend for people, and that'll kind of put a bow on this presentation. So, why this matters: taxes are actually the largest expense that an average American will have in their lifetime. And it's estimated that they typically pay out around 1/3 of their total income over your lifetime in taxes. So, this is definitely not something I would just leave up to chance. I would take matters into your own hands, which is exactly what you're doing by watching this video. So, how do income taxes work in the US? Well, at the most simple level, anytime you make money, the government wants a piece of that money. Sometimes they already have their hands on it if you're working a W 2 job, and that'll go out with withholdings. Or if you run your own business or you're in some other unique situations, they won't have access to that money and they'll probably want a payment from you at some point during the year, maybe quarterly or maybe when you file your tax return, depending on how much you make. So one of the most common questions I always get is, what's the difference between a tax return and a tax refund? Well, the tax return is simply the piece of paper that you file once a year, now electronically, which is nice. And your tax refund is if you actually paid the government a little bit too much during the year, they'll say, hey, you gave us a little bit too much. Here's the leftovers for you. One cool thing I always like to think about is that the tax refund for a lot of Americans is actually the number one biggest check they'll receive for the entire year, which is kind of crazy to think about. So it really puts into perspective how much this can mean to people. And so that's really why I wanted to create this video, is because there's no worse feeling, than hopping on an online software to file your tax return and seeing that you actually owe more money when you worked all year long. So to kind of explain why that might happen, the first thing that I see that's very common is if you work multiple W 2 jobs. So you're an employee at different places throughout the year. Maybe you started or stopped at a different company. Those employers don't talk to each other, and the amount of tax that was withheld on your paychecks isn't compared to the other jobs that you worked. So odds are what happened is they only took out a little bit from each job because they assumed that you didn't make much. But when you combine all that income together, you're probably going to owe more in taxes than what they withheld. So you're probably going to have an additional amount of tax due at the end of the year. Another one that I see that's pretty common is when a taxpayer gets divorced and they have a kid, and that kid is splitting custody between the parents. So there's this thing called a custodial parent, and that basically means if someone has their child stay with them for more than half the days in the year, technically that person is able to claim that person as their dependent and get some of the dependent care benefits. Now, if you don't have custodial rights and you get dependent care benefits on your W 2, I think it might be in box 10, and you see a number in there, well, that number is going to show up on your tax return and count as additional income. So it's still great that your employer gave you money to put towards dependent care, but unless you're actually having that dependent on your tax return as your dependent, you will get taxed on it. It won't be a tax-free benefit. If you're interested in learning more, you could take a look at publication 503 for child and dependent care expenses if you want some nice light reading. Another one I see a lot is for people who resold concert tickets. I know this is incredibly common in the Swiftie community when you bought tickets for a show and you ended up selling one of your tickets and made a ton of money on it. You'll probably get a 1099 from Ticketmaster or one of these companies saying, hey, here's extra income. We sent this 1099 to the IRS, so we're expecting to see it on your personal tax return too. Now, there's some things you can consider there of what's true income, what's personal income, and if that was split out between friends. There's a lot of nuance there, but this is definitely a common area I see a lot. So, the number one tax tip I would give to you, which is what you're already doing, is take your own financial education into your own hands. Read a book, read an article, watch a YouTube video like this, and try to understand, what might happen to me this year and what can I do early before the end of the year to set myself up for tax time. You can take a look at one of my other videos where I go over the 5 big tax planning tips that I think could help. So yeah, that wraps it up. Thanks for watching. I know this was high level, but hopefully it helps as I'm really passionate about spreading more information on financial literacy. If you have more questions, you can email me. Thank you.